The possibility of a full-scale military conflict between the United States and Iran has been a looming shadow over global geopolitics for years. With tensions rising and diplomatic efforts often failing to produce long-term peace, the world watches anxiously, knowing that even the smallest spark could ignite a devastating war. But what would such a war look like? What would be the consequences, not just for the two nations involved but for the entire world? And perhaps most importantly, would other powerful nations like Russia and China remain on the sidelines, or would they be drawn into the conflict, creating a scenario that could spiral far beyond the Middle East? If war were to break out, the Middle East would be plunged into chaos, further destabilizing a region already riddled with conflict, sectarian violence, and fragile alliances. Iran, with its deeply rooted influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, could mobilize its allied militias, transforming the war into a multi-front battlefield. The U.S. and its allies, particularly Israel and Saudi Arabia, would likely face an asymmetric warfare strategy from Iran, with missile strikes, cyber attacks, and proxy warfare disrupting military and economic stability across the region. Israel, long concerned about Iran's nuclear ambitions, has been vocal about the need to curb Tehran's power, even if it means unilateral military action. If the United States hesitates to take the lead, Israel might strike first, forcing Washington into a direct confrontation with Iran. This would mark the beginning of a conflict unlike any other seen in modern history. Beyond the battlefield, the economic consequences of such a war would be catastrophic. One of the first and most immediate effects would be the disruption of oil shipments through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow but strategically vital waterway through which nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply flows. Iran has long threatened to block the strait if provoked, and in the event of war, it would likely follow through on this warning. A blockade of this scale would send global oil prices skyrocketing, leading to inflation, economic recessions, and financial instability across the world. Countries heavily reliant on oil imports, such as China and India, would face severe energy crises, while the Western world would struggle with rising fuel costs and disrupted supply chains. The global stock markets, already volatile in times of geopolitical uncertainty, would likely experience sharp crashes, further deepening the economic turmoil. However, the economic impact would extend far beyond just oil prices. Defense spending would surge as nations prepare for potential spillover effects, drawing funds away from crucial domestic sectors such as health care, education, and infrastructure. The United States, already the world's largest military spender, would be forced to funnel even more resources into sustaining a prolonged war effort, leading to increased national debt and economic strain. Meanwhile, Iran, though significantly outmatched in terms of military resources, would leverage its cyber capabilities to launch attacks on critical U.S. infrastructure, targeting financial institutions, energy grids, and government systems. The resulting digital warfare could cripple major industries, causing widespread panic and economic devastation beyond the physical battlefield. Yet, the true danger of a US-Iran war lies not just in the direct confrontation between the two nations, but in the broader implications for global security. If war erupts, it is almost certain that it will not remain confined to just Iran and the United States. The conflict could escalate into a full-scale regional war, dragging in neighboring countries such as Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, where Iranian-backed militias hold significant power. Additionally, U.S. military bases across the Middle East would become prime targets for Iranian retaliation, prompting counterattacks that could level cities and disrupt entire governments. The presence of non-state actors, such as Hezbollah and the Houthis, would further complicate the war, as these groups have a history of launching missile attacks and guerrilla operations that could spread the violence far beyond the initial war zone. Amidst all this chaos, there is another layer of complexity: Iran's nuclear program. If Iran perceives an existential threat from a U.S. invasion or airstrike campaign, it might accelerate its nuclear ambitions in an attempt to develop a deterrent. The prospect of Iran obtaining nuclear weapons would send shockwaves through the global community, triggering a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Countries like Saudi Arabia, long wary of Tehran's military capabilities, could seek their own nuclear deterrence, setting off a chain reaction of proliferation that could undo decades of efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. The United Nations and international watchdogs would scramble to contain the situation, but by that point, the damage might already be done, permanently altering the balance of power in the region. While the U.S. and Iran remain the central players in this potential conflict, the involvement of global superpowers like Russia and China cannot be ignored. Both nations have strategic alliances with Iran, making it unlikely that they would remain completely neutral in the event of a war. Russia, already engaged in Middle Eastern conflicts through its involvement in Syria, would likely provide military and intelligence support to Iran, either covertly or openly. Moscow has a vested interest in countering U.S. influence in the region and could use the war as an opportunity to strengthen its position. Meanwhile, China, though less inclined to engage in direct military intervention, would have significant economic stakes in ensuring the conflict does not disrupt its access to Iranian oil. Beijing might leverage its diplomatic influence to push for ceasefires and negotiations, but if its energy interests are threatened, it could escalate its involvement in ways that could complicate the geopolitical landscape even further. The question then arises, can such a war be avoided? History has shown that diplomacy, though fragile, is the most effective tool in preventing catastrophic conflicts. However, with political tensions, ideological differences, and years of hostility between the U.S. and Iran, diplomacy alone may not be enough to keep war at bay. The international community, including the United Nations and key global powers, must play a more active role in mediating discussions, ensuring that de-escalation remains a priority. Sanctions, while often used as a means to pressure Iran, may only serve to fuel further resentment, pushing Tehran into a corner where war becomes an inevitable response. Instead, economic incentives, security assurances, and regional cooperation could pave the way for long-term stability. At the heart of this conflict lies the reality that war, no matter how justified it may seem to some, is never without consequences. The human cost alone would be staggering: thousands of lives lost, millions displaced, and entire generations scarred by the horrors of battle. Civilians, caught in the crossfire of political agendas, would bear the brunt of the destruction, forced to flee their homes as cities are reduced to rubble. The humanitarian crisis that would follow would overwhelm international aid organizations, leaving countless people without access to food, water, or medical care. The lessons of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria serve as grim reminders of what happens when war spirals out of control, and yet the world seems perpetually on the edge of repeating history. So, as the world watches the ever-shifting dynamics between the U.S. and Iran, one question remains: is there still time to step back from the brink, or have we already set the stage for yet another devastating war? The answer lies not just in the decisions made by world leaders, but in the collective will of nations to prioritize peace over destruction. Because at the end of the day, no victory in war is ever truly a victory, it is merely survival at an unbearable cost.
Stay tuned for more updates on this developing story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for the latest insights and analyses.